August 7th, 1942. Rabaul, before first light. In the glow of hurricane lamps, fuel men worked in a choreography of funnels and hand pumps, the aroma of high-octane gasoline mixing with volcanic sulfur drifting off the Bismarck Sea. On a line of pale green fighters, A6M2 Model 21s, the ground crews heaved a single droppable tank under each belly, the metal cool as river stones. Those tanks were not decorations. They were the difference between arrival and disappearance. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, roughly 560 nautical miles one way, about 650 miles into the dark, across weather and empty sea, across the map's white space where fuel calculations were either correct or fatal. Petty Officer First Class Saburō Sakai walked the line with gloved hands, tapping aluminum skins, counting in his head the math of the day. Internal fuel plus the droppable tank equals endurance. Endurance minus climb, cruise, combat, and contingency equals life. The zero had been designed for this kind of math, Japan's empire drawn in long, thin arcs of radius and return. With a droppable tank, the Model 21 could fly more than 1,600 miles, an astonishing figure for a single-engine fighter, and one the Americans had laughed off until the war forced them to stop laughing. But that range had been purchased with hard compromises. No armor plate behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was reach traded for resilience, radius purchased at the cost of mercy. The order that roused Rabaul's airfields came from urgency. American Marines were ashore on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The Tainan Air Group, their Zero outfit, would launch to strike and scout, to find the invaders' ships and the carriers that guarded them, and to strip the sky ahead of any opposition. They were veterans, many with the China War in their logbooks, and they knew the day's problem in their bones. Fuel to get there, seconds to fight, fuel to get home. Every bullet fired, every minute spent banking in a dogfight, was minutes shaved off the invisible reserve that might be needed to clear the last volcanic ridge at Rabaul. Sakai's mechanics cinched the drop tank's shackles home. He touched the release lever in the cockpit, feeling its throw. Muscle memory for the moment when combat would demand clean wings, and the ocean below would claim a perfectly good piece of hardware. He tugged the lap belt, tested the stick, and looked across the ramp at other Zeros winking their position lights as the sky paled. The math repeated. Climb at power to 20,000 feet over the Solomon Sea. Cruise lean. Keep the formation tight to share eyes. Share sky. 2 hours outbound. 10 minutes over target if luck held. 2 hours back with the fuel needles whispering bad news in the last 40 minutes. He did not think of Henderson Field by name. No one on Rabaul used the American name yet, but of the strip the enemy wanted. The strip the enemy would turn into a thorn if the Japanese did not make the arithmetic work today. Dawn lifted like a curtain, revealing a line of green-black water and the eraser smear of cloud. Their takeoff rolled them single file into the wind, wheels flicking spray from yesterday's squall, propeller tips a silver blur. The Zeros climbed as a flock, the formation flattening at altitude where the air thinned and the math sharpened. Lean the mixture until the engine stumbled, then richen a quarter turn. Watch cylinder head temperatures. Accept that every improvement in miles per gallon came from the edge of a stall and the edge of a gamble. Out front, the lead element picked its way along familiar star points. Duke of York Islands off the wingtip, the long scythe of New Ireland falling astern, then nothing but compass and the charted positions of rain. They had been told to expect dive bombers and fighters from the US carriers, Dauntlesses and Wildcats flown by pilots who had learned their craft over peacetime cornfields and arrived with the kind of logistics Japan could not match. The Americans' new code word for Guadalcanal was cactus, and before the month was out, they would dry a strip there and fly from it, turning range into residency. But not today. Today, the sky over the island's north coast belonged to whoever had arrived first, with enough fuel to fight and enough luck to leave. Southward, the sea changed texture, shoals and reef lines, then the jagged tooth of Saburō Island breaking the horizon. Smoke pillars rose where naval gunfire had found the beaches. Then the lines of American aircraft, ants from a child's height, resolved into living threats. Wildcats escorted the bombing runs, stout little Grummons that did not turn like Zeros but would soak up punishment that would have ripped a Japanese fighter to lace. Sakai's mind translated silhouettes to equations. The Wildcat's armour versus his cannon's HEI rounds, his own unarmoured skin versus their .50 calibers, the fuel needle's drift versus the temptation to circle for a perfect shot. Range against time, reach against risk. The first pass came fast, always fast, because energy was a currency, and the side that spent it wastefully went home by parachute or not at all. The Zeros slashed through the escorts and the Dauntless boxes with their rear seats bristling. Those backseat guns were more than decoration. They were geometry traps, cones of tracers out of which even an ace could not always compute an exit. Somewhere in that exploding thicket, the day would write a note under Sakai's left eye that he would read for the rest of his life. But at dawn it was only probabilities in the air, only the smooth confidence of a machine that could outclimb, outroll, outturn, provided the pilot did not ask it for something it could not grant, to be both far-ranging and invulnerable. He checked mixture again. Too rich was waste, too lean was detonation, and trimmed for the long cruise. The Model 21's genius was not speed, but balance, light structure, broad wings, and the moral courage of a designer who had signed away armour to write endurance into the airplane's bones. American pilots would later say the Zero could hang on its prop and pirouette like a fish. What they meant was that it inverted the usual contracts. You could not bludgeon it like a Wildcat or a P-40. You danced with it or died. Above the blue-green water of Ironbottom Sound, the formation tightened yet again, and the leader tipped his wing toward Lunga Point. On the beach, Marines advanced behind their own arithmetic. Rounds per man, calories per day, what a Seabee could bulldoze before dark. Out beyond Saburō, U.S. carriers breathed airplanes like a city exhales traffic. The Americans could rotate squadrons, rotate engines, rotate men. Japan could not. For the moment, none of that mattered to a Japanese pilot at 18,000 feet with a fuel gauge like a metronome and a sun that would ride his shoulder on the long homeward leg. Today was a problem of minutes and gallons, not grand strategy. Later, historians would measure the day with maps and tonnages and write of the Cactus Air Force as if it had always existed, as if Henderson Field's Marston Mat had fallen from the sky already riveted. In the cockpit, the story felt narrower and sharper, the wobble of a fuel needle, the glare of an early sun across a gun sight, the knowledge that the Zero's range, the very gift that had brought a pilot here, demanded terrible restraint once he arrived. Sakai breathed through the mask, tasted rubber and gasoline, and watched the coastline sharpen, green jungle spooling out like a rug suddenly unrolled. Range had carried him to the threshold. Fuel would decide how long he could stay, and whether the metal lifeline beneath his fuselage would clatter free into the sea today or ride home dry as bone. In that calculus lived the truth of Rabaul's dawn. In 1942, the sky over Guadalcanal did not belong to bravery or doctrine. It belonged to the pilot who could do arithmetic at altitude. August 7th, 1942. Noon sun over Ironbottom Sound. The horizon was a geometry of wakes and smoke, a transport fleet exhaling landing craft toward beaches where Marines were already rewriting maps. Over that moving city, 8 Wildcats from VF-5 orbited on thin fuel, the only fighter screen on station when the first Japanese strike slid out of the clouds. The patrol's leader, Lieutenant James Pug Southerland II of USS Saratoga, saw the bomb bay doors of twin-engine Bettys yawn open and understood the arithmetic instantly. Altitudes, angles, seconds to intercept before bombs fell on ships, and minutes of gas left to get home. He rolled to attack. Above, Saburō Sakai's Zero, lean on mixture and heavy with distance, tipped toward the intruders. Two men about to solve the same problem with different machines. Sutherland's first pass was textbook violence. Coming in from the right, he hosed a Betty and watched fire run the fuselage like ink under water. Another bomber went smoking after a second burst, the Wildcats 4.5s drawing a line so bright even the gunners in the transports below could read it. Climbing to reposition, he looked up into a sky that had thickened with zeros. The kill ledger already had entries. The problem now was survival. He had traded altitude for results and invited company. Sakai's section threaded into the fight from advantage: height, sun, speed. The Zero's strengths demanded economy. Slash, don't circle. Spend energy and leave before American guns could spool their ugly music. Yet as Sakai dropped his nose, the fight collapsed into the intimate mathematics pilot's dread and right about forever. Radius against radius, roll rate against stick force, the space of a cockpit against the world beyond it. Below them was Tulagi, raked by naval gunfire. Between was a web of contrails and the glitter of empty shell cases tumbling through tropical light. The Wildcat that refused to die belonged to Sutherland. He had already been in a turning brawl with two Zeros and had lived to call it even, proof of the Grumman's brutish grace and the pilot's fists-up stubbornness. Sakai watched the American haul the stub-winged fighter through a looping defence that wasted speed but bought seconds, then dove after him anyway. The first burst from the Zero's 20mm cannon walked too far forward. The second found meat. Sutherland's engine erupted, the prop froze, and the F4F fell off into a smoking half-roll. The canopy slid, a figure tumbled, a parachute blossomed like a pale flower over the green of Guadalcanal's coast. The dogfight's ledger closed on one line: pilot alive. Airplane. Wreckage. That falling figure would walk out. 11 wounds, a pistol lost in the cockpit when it snagged during egress, a trek through jungle aided by islanders who risked everything to deliver him back to the new American footprint at Lunga. Naval records and later archaeology would find the Wildcat where it hit the world and stayed, bureau number 5192, Black F-12, history's shrapnel turned to evidence. The story moved from memoir and ready room to ground truth, metal with numbers, a crash site where vines tried to forget. For Sakai, the fight did not end with the falling chute. Over the transports and beaches, SBD Dauntlesses droned in defensive boxes, their rear seats bristling with twin .30s and the sort of patience only a two-man crew can impose on a sky full of enemies. The Zero's mastery in a one-circle fight turned uncertain against well-flown dive bombers that could soak punishment and spit it back. Sakai slid in behind one section, fangs out for easy meat, and met mathematics he could not bully, converging fields of fire, armour and fuel tanks that did not erupt at the first spark. Somewhere in that lattice a rear gunner found him. A burst shattered his canopy and changed his life. The bullet that tore through his head took an eye and gave him a permanent companion: pain. Post-war accounts most often name the gunner as Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class Harold L. Jones, whose short, savage string punched the Zero's cockpit full of daylight. The legend emphasizes what came next because it seems impossible. Blinded in one eye, blood flooding his goggles, half paralyzed and half conscious, Sakai did not die. He stayed with the machine. He leveled the Zero, fought the vertigo, and pointed north, 650 miles of sea between him and Rabaul, a literal ocean of willpower. The Model 21's very compromises, no armour, no self-sealing tanks, had bought range. Now that range became a tourniquet. The drop tank under his belly had been emptied long ago, but the math of cruise, wind and miracle still penciled out to maybe. He chose maybe. The sky over Tulagi and Guadalcanal closed behind him like a wound that would not heal. Below, the first day of Watchtower kept moving. Beaches secured, foxholes dug, officers drawing neat lines on maps over terrain that would erase them by midnight. Across that machinery, the absence of a single Wildcat and a single Zero would barely smudge a page. But air wars are fought both by armies and by men inside cockpits who discover how many numbers a brain can hold when blood is leaking from the same brain. Heading, airspeed, time, the pitch of a prop, the taste of gasoline in the back of the throat. For Southerland, it became the cadence of footfalls and the code of generosity from strangers. For Sakai, the drone of a Sakai engine at lean of peak. The prayer that the next squall line would not add headwind to injury. Historians would later weigh the engagement with careful scales. Which Zero fired first, whether Sakai's wingmen, often identified in Japanese records as Uto and Yamazaki, also scored hits. How many Bettys actually fell to Southerland before the knives came out? The broad outline holds steady. VF-5's thin CAP swatted at a strike much too large. Zeros from the Tainan Air Group took their pound of flesh. One Wildcat pilot's stubborn duel ended under silk. One Zero Ace's predatory run on the SBDs ended with a bullet in his head and a navigation problem that could have been an epitaph. There is a seductive myth that machines decide these things. The F4F was tough. The A6M was agile. Therefore, outcomes follow spec sheets. But the day's math says otherwise. Sutherland made the impossible look routine, firing at bombers he had no business reaching, then outlasting Zeros in a knife fight long enough to buy a chute and a second act. Sakai, wounded by a slow dive bomber, the Zero was supposed to devour, refused the undertow and flew a crippled fighter hundreds of miles home. The ledger shows two machines behaving exactly as built, and two pilots refusing to be only what their airplanes implied. By evening, records ashore and afloat tried to cage chaos in columns, claims, losses, coordinates. The US counted a lodgment at Lunga and Tulagi. Japan counted distance and rage. Sakai reached Rabaul by will and fuel and blood. Southerland reached Henderson 2 weeks later by jungle paths and luck. Both would fly again. The arithmetic of day one closed with a remainder the campaign would worry at for 6 months. Range versus basing, armour versus agility, bravery versus supply. In that remainder, the Solomon Islands discovered their law of motion. Over Tulagi at noon, 2 men taught the opening class. August 7th, 1942. Noon crept toward 1 o'clock over Tulagi, and the sky had become a machine that ground men into numbers. Saburō Sakai, who had carved arcs through Wildcats and Bettys all morning, saw a gaggle of slow movers and judged them easy meat, 8 Douglas SBD Dauntlesses holding a tight defensive box. He came in from astern, exactly where a Zero should rule. The mistake announced itself in a single stitched burst. Twin .30s from a rear seat reached forward along a rigid cone of geometry and found the cockpit. Canopy glass burst inward, metal fragments and a bullet scythed across his face. The Zero leapt like an animal kicked in the spine. For a moment Sakai saw nothing but milk-white glare and the remembered shape of his gun sight. The Dauntless he had dismissed had answered with mathematics of its own, armour plate, interlocking fields of fire, and the implacable patience of a 2-man crew. The wound was not theatre. Contemporary American and Japanese accounts converge on the same brutal outline. An SBD rear gunner shattered Sakai's canopy and creased his skull, blinding him in the right eye and briefly paralysing the left side of his body. Some documents name the gunner, Aviation Ordnanceman 2nd Class Harold Lew Jones, as the man behind the guns. Others keep the attribution broader, crediting the formation's tail gunners as a group. The fog of a first day's chaos never fully burned off, but the effect did not need a single name to be historical fact. A Zero Ace who had come hunting was suddenly flying half-sensate through a cockpit filled with glass, fuel vapours and blood. The first instinct was gravity. The Zero rolled and fell, nose pitching toward a sea as blue and bright as a blade. Sakai later admitted the thought that followed: ram a ship, die a samurai, take enemies with him rather than surrender to blindness. Cold air pouring through the wrecked canopy shocked him back to arithmetic. He could still read a needle through the smear. He could still coax the Sakai engine into leaner mixture. He could still reach north if the wind did not turn traitor. Between a theatrical death and a painful calculation, he chose the latter and eased the prop to a note the airplane could hum for hours. Range, so often the Zero's invisible weapon, now became a tourniquet. Rabaul was over 500 nautical miles away across weather and chance. The droppable tank was long dry. The internal tanks bled by combat power and by minutes stolen for turning fights. He set a heading by memory and coastline, then by nothing but the compass card and the shapes of cloud and light on water. He could not clear the sticking film of blood from his goggles, so he flew half-blind, cheeks stung by wind and teeth grit against the taste of gasoline. Above the cylinder heads the mixture went to the edge of cough, then a quarter-turn rich. Speed bled away into endurance. The Pacific grew larger with every practical decision. Behind him the fight moved on. On the beaches at Guadalcanal, Marines marked ground with entrenching tools, while the ships offshore hoisted more cargo into the thin new history the Americans would call Henderson Field. In the air, claims were inked and overclaims quietly ignored. Lieutenant James Pug Sutherland trailed silk into the green and began a wounded man's long walk guided by islanders. Both stories would harden into artifacts later. Sutherland's Wildcat found in the jungle in 1998, its bureau number matching the logbook. Sakai's helmet kept and shown, the leather torn and stained, a small exhibit for a large day. For now, each pilot grappled with an element the other no longer controlled. Sutherland with ground, Sakai with sky. He trimmed hands off when he could, because hands shook. He flew with the right eye dark and the left a raw slit peering through ruined glass, because quitting was a verb he did not know in any language. The bullet's path had carved a furrow, not an exit wound, but shock makes its own physics. Every 10 minutes he reran the same sums: airspeed versus fuel flow, drift versus compass, pain versus patience. He dared a slow climb to ride cooler air, then flattened to spare the engine. The Model 21's bones, light, unarmoured, unforgiving, had earned his faith. Now they demanded his discipline. Somewhere between Vella La Vella and the long reach of Bougainville, he found a rhythm that hurt less than panic. North began to mean home again. It is tempting to varnish such flying with words like miracle, but the return was not supernatural. It was the inverse of all the extravagance American pilots would later enjoy. Where a Wildcat, or later a P-38, might climb away and call a controller for a steer, Sakai had no radio, no vector, and no margin. He had range because his airplane did not carry armour. He had endurance because he traded speed for mixture until the engine's voice dropped to a thrifty murmur. The same design choices that made a Zero explode when a .50 caliber round found a tank also made the airframe a compass needle tracing Empire's long lines. In that sense, the flight was not a miracle. It was an obedience, to numbers, to an airplane's logic, to the geometry of survival. By late afternoon, Rabaul's extinct cones began to appear like memory-made stone. Mother and North Daughter rising out of haze, the caldera's rim lifting where water met rock. The needles had sagged past comfort into prayer. He had flown for 4 hours and more with fuel trickling somewhere invisible and hope doing the rest. The approach was nearly a catastrophe. Depth perception wrecked, body numb and heavy, he lined up, drifted, overcorrected, and suddenly every parked Zero on the field loomed as a grave marker with his name. He clawed around, tried again, circled once more, slow, lower, leaner, then dropped the Model 21 onto the strip, fuel gauges all but flat, tires whispering the end of the problem he had been solving since noon. He did not climb down so much as paw out of the cockpit. He refused the stretcher until he finished his report. Then he collapsed. Medical notes and later obituaries confirm what the flight had cost: blindness in the right eye, partial paralysis at onset, and a surgery in Japan that he endured without anesthesia. An element of legend that nonetheless shows up again and again in interviews and press accounts. Recovery would be long, combat would wait, the campaign would proceed without its most famous hunter. But the cultural mathematics of the Pacific War were already changing. At Guadalcanal, the Americans were turning range into residence, Cactus Air Force rising off a captured strip to punish every daylight movement. For Japan, even its greatest tacticians were now bound to logistics and distance. Sakai's return etched that reality in blood and wind. Historians argue over small angles of this day: the exact gunner behind the wounding burst, the minute count in the log, the sequence of attacks around Tulagi, but the load-bearing facts do not wobble. A zero ace dove on Dauntlesses and was ripped open by their tail guns. He recovered a crippled fighter, half blind and half sensate, and flew nearly 5 hours over 560 nautical miles to Rabaul, landing with fumes and willpower. In a campaign that would often be reduced to tonnages and convoys, this single act returns us to the cockpit, to the arithmetic at altitude where fuel, pain and distance decide whether a man becomes a statistic or an anecdote. On August 7, 1942, Saburō Sakai became both. A data point in a day's claims, and a story pilots told each other in mess halls for the rest of their lives. Henderson Field did not begin as an airbase, it began as a claim. Corals scraped flat by Japanese bulldozers, seized by Marines on 7th August, hammered into usefulness by human stubbornness and fuel in 55-gallon drums. In the mornings the strip was a chalky ribbon, by noon it was a furnace, by evening it was pitted and rutted and still good enough. The first truth of Guadalcanal was that airplanes which could be abused and mended would fly again tomorrow. The second truth was that tomorrow favoured the side whose airframes were built to survive a single mistake. The Cactus Air Force, improvised, under strength, hungry, learned the second truth in the opening week. Wildcats rolled out of revetments smelling of dope and hot oil, armour plate glinting behind the pilot's head, self-sealing tanks sloshing quietly like insurance policies. They were not elegant, they were not fast, but when a Zero's 20mm shells stitched the fuselage and the fight fell to gravity, the Grumman would dig its nose, cough, and keep flying with panels flapping like torn flags. Grumman Iron Works, the Navy called the company, as if metallurgy were a philosophy. On Henderson, it was gospel. SBD Dauntlesses, low and stubborn, armed the back seat with twin 30-aughts and scorn. A well-flown box of SBDs played geometry as if a draftsman were at the yoke, cones of fire overlapping, blind spots covered, nerves calm. The rear gunner's bullets were small, but their math was large. 2 men dividing labour under fire, one to hold the dive bomber steady, one to remind predators that preys bite. Where a Zero's first burst often turned an opponent's cockpit into wind and noise, a Wildcat or SBD's first wound was not the end. It was the beginning of a return trip. Armour and self-sealing did not make them invincible. They made them educable. Crews returned to the mess that night, absorbed lessons, and flew smarter the next day. Henderson's advantage compounded like interest. Across the slot, the arithmetic ran cruel in reverse. The A6M2 had been born light on purpose. No pilot armour, no tank lining, skin and spars paired to a shimmer. In the first year of the war, that choice made poetry in the air. Climb like breath, turn like thought, range like rumour. Over Cactus, the same choice turned to debt. A single good point .50 caliber burst from a Wildcat, a TBF. Even an angry truck's pedestal gun could bring the Zero to flash fire and silk. The Type 99 20mm cannons in the Zero's wings, each fed by a 60-round drum, hit harder than the American rifle-caliber guns of 1941, but Guadalcanal was 1942, and the defenders' heavy Brownings threw ounces of metal with the reliability of a factory line. The Japanese ace, who misjudged by a finger's width, often paid with an airframe that could not forgive. Henderson's daily routine became a drill in probabilities. Somewhere between mid-morning and midday, the noon Betties, G4M bombers from Rabaul, would appear high, their long wings shimmering. They were fast for twins, long-legged like the Zero, and, like the Zero, fatally optimistic about gasoline and bullets. Self-sealing would have cost range. Range had been the point. Cactus scrambled. Wildcats climbed on patience rather than performance. SBDs and TBFS joined the dragnet. Every .50 in the perimeter lifted a muzzle skyward. The G4M's torpedoes and bombs promised catastrophe. Their bare tanks promised fireworks. Often both promises were kept in the same minute. The bombers came because doctrine and necessity demanded it. They fell because Henderson could answer with repetition. On the ground, survival was logistics with calluses. Fuel came ashore under fire, rolled by hand, pumped by wobble pump into Wildcats and SBDs, while armourers grinned through grime. CBs carved new taxiways out of coral as if they were whittling. Marines wired revetments with scrap steel and prayer. Cactus Airways, C-47s thumped in after dark with parts and people and hope, lifting out the wounded and the restless. Every barrel that made it to the line multiplied tomorrow. Every part cannibalized from a wrecked airframe kept 3 others in the pattern. In that barter lay Henderson's genius, not excellence, but persistence. Pilots felt the difference in their bones. A Wildcat could take a 20mm in the wing root, cough and limp home. The same hit on a Zero turned into flame in the cockpit and a choice between the sea and the trees. A Dauntless could soak a head-on, dive away smoking, and present its tail sting as a parting insult. The Zero that absorbed a belt of .50s in the engine face took the Sakai's last breath through a cracked case and rode smoke to the water, which meant that an American pilot who made a mistake came back to make fewer tomorrow. A Japanese pilot who made a mistake did not. The ledger kept growing. The Americans' .5s jammed less and hit with more certainty than Japanese 7.7s. Their windshields turned a lucky cannon fragment into a gouge instead of an epitaph. Their self-sealing fuel cells turned a spark into a stain. The Japanese 20mm hit like a hammer when they hit at all, but the drums emptied faster than rage, and reloads were for ground crews, not fights. Over Henderson, fights lasted longer than drums. Henderson's calculus shaped tactics. Marine and Navy pilots learned to deny the Zero its first bite. Stay fast, dive out, fight in the vertical where the heavy American wings could cash in speed for altitude, and the Zero could not claw it back as quickly. The Thatch Weave, born earlier, found new utility here. 2 Wildcats crossing and recrossing to bait a pursuer into the killing lane of his friend. It was a tactic built on trust and radios, and the patience of pilots who expected to live long enough to try it again if they botched it. The Zero's answer, slash and go, never linger, worked until it didn't, until a single American burst turned mathematics into smoke. Even on the ground, Henderson's arithmetic saved lives. Crash land a Zero within the perimeter and it became a bonfire and a souvenir. Crash land a Wildcat and it became a parts depot by afternoon and a flying airplane by morning. The field hospital counted survivors by the hour. The squadron diary counted airframes by tail number. Both books told the same story in different dialects. The Cactus Air Force was not better equipped in the sense inventories love. It was better configured to survive shortfalls. Each day began in deficit and ended in flight lines stubbornly full enough. None of this erased the fear. The strip was shelled at night by warships in black water. Washing Machine Charlie, lonely Japanese night raiders, carved insomnia into the ribs of sleeping men. Malaria made liars of healthy mornings by noon. Pilots climbed into cockpits with quinine in their pockets and fever hidden under bravado. But the knowledge that the airplane could take a punch mattered. It put a different weight in the right hand, on the throttle, into the dive, across the merge. Men fly differently when they trust the machine to forgive. Across the slot, the Tainan and later 251 Air Group kept coming because the Empire's map left no other choice. Their aces were as skilled as pilots get, and many were braver than the war deserved. But the machine under them had been optimized for another year, another kind of fight, a fence without attrition. At Guadalcanal, attrition was the only constant. A culture that fed mastery into fragile airframes found that mastery leaks away when the airframes burn. A culture that fed average men into durable airframes found that average men, kept alive, become deadly very quickly. By late September, Henderson's pattern had a rhythm that wouldn't quit: launch at siren, climb on grit, meet the noon raid, land with holes, patch with sheet metal, gas from drums, launch again at dusk against barges that tried to sneak the Tokyo Express down the slot. Men slept in trenches, engines cooled under moonlight, armourers counted belts like rosary. The ledger closed each day with no elegance at all, just sums that always included enough. Enough airplanes to launch, enough fuel to pump, enough pilots to climb. The campaign's verdict grew in the margins of those sums. Armour plate and self-sealing did not make heroes, men did that themselves, but they kept heroes in the roster. The cost of a single burst cut both ways, and Henderson made sure the bill went mostly to the visitor. In air power, as in any trade, the product is not a sortie but a tomorrow. Guadalcanal sold tomorrow's deer. The side that could pay in steel and rubber and second chances bought the island day by day, until the calendar itself became a weapon. By the time the rains came and the revetments were roofed against them, the arithmetic no longer looked like courage versus courage. It looked like machines that could take a hit against machines that could not, and men who came back from the debrief to fly again and again and again. There was an empty bunk at Lacunae and later at Buin that mechanics pretended not to see. The name chalked above it, Sakai, stayed a little longer than orders required, because habits have inertia. He was in Japan under knives and bandages, learning to live with one eye. The Tainan Air Group, reflagged and filtered through replacements, kept flying south without him, 20-minute briefings for 4-hour missions, pencils scraping maps of the slot that looked like a metronome laid across the sea. The arithmetic changed the day the A6M2 Model 32 showed up. Clipped wings, squared tips, a faster roll rate in the vertical and a tighter dive, but at a cost that every crew chief could recite from memory: less fuel. From Rabaul, Guadalcanal had already been a reach. From Buin's dust and coral, it was a reach with no slack. The forward fields, Kahili, Balale, Shortland, were Japan's answer to geometry. Park closer to the problem, fight with minutes instead of seconds. The men understood the bargain. Range traded for bite, bite traded for borrowed time. The later Model 22 restored the long wing and the reach, but the lesson stayed chalked on the board: all grace is paid for. Henderson Field made them pay daily. The Cactus Air Force grew like a stubborn weed: VMF 223's Wildcats, VMSB 232's Dauntlesses, Army P400s with their anemic turbos and unexpectedly lethal nose guns, then P38 Lightnings slanting down from Espiritu Santo in November, with the long legs that turned the slot into a hunting ground. Joe Foss arrived with VMF 121 and began to tally in a way that rewrote squadron briefings. Captain John L. Smith's name passed across ready rooms like weather. Every day the chalk dust rose on both sides. Betty's downed, Zeros damaged, Wildcats lost, Dauntlesses returned with holes you could put a fist through. The numbers lied and told the truth in equal measure. Claims always exceed wreckage. But the trend line does not lie. Pilots who had flown wing on Sakai now flew under new leaders whose nerves were still green. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa held his own poetry in the sky. Energy hoarded, angles parcelled, range and roll turned into a private language. Toshio Ota carved ellipses that made men on the ground crane their necks and forget their helmets. Junichi Sasai, polite on the ground and kill-cold in the air, did not come back from an August fight. Over the next months, the roster thinned in a way that both sides could feel like a temperature drop. Aces are not a strategy. They are a delaying tactic written in contrails. Tactics bent to Henderson's math. If you joined the fight above the field, you were already late. The cactus pattern stacked fighters in layers now, radios knitting them together, a weave here, a bounce there, SBD boxes low and rude with their rear guns pointed outward like quills. The noon Betties found fewer straight lines to their bomb runs, and more streaks of fire in the sky that followed a single brutal rule. Self-sealing buys another minute, and a minute is the difference between wreckage in the jungle and a logbook entry at dusk. Zero's still killed at the merge. There is no armour against a perfect burst. But the merge had become a harder room to enter. Nights belonged to destroyers. The Tokyo Express ran down the slot at 30 knots with decks awash, feeding men and shells into a maw that ground them fine. Daylight took its tithe anyway. Every G4M Betty that skimmed the surf into Ironbottom Sound had been built on the same bargain as the Zero, fuel instead of forgiveness. The Marines' 50 calibers, the Navy's 5-inch guns, and the cactus fighters collected their tax in flame. Still they came. Doctrine is a kind of gravity. Buin learned new rituals. Fuel drums rolled like coffins. Armourers stacked 7.7 belts and lifted 20mm drums with wrists that never healed. A Zero came back with its engine face peppered and its left tank weeping. The crew would pull the cowl, wipe the tears, and scab the skin with doped fabric and hope. Pilots walked the line with their hands tucked behind them because touching was a prayer they couldn't afford. If a man didn't return, someone wiped his name off the chalkboard with the edge of a sleeve and wrote sortie next to someone else's. Sakai's absence became a kind of instrument. Ground crews compared new men to the missing ace and found them wanting until the war taught them otherwise or took the question away. Letters reached him in Japan that smelled of oil and mildew. They told him how the fight had changed. The Americans climb away now and come back with friends. The P-38s do not run out of sky. The Wildcats attack and keep attacking because their engines keep turning after a head-on. The SBDs are still insolent. Tell that rear gunner you owe him a drink if you meet him in hell. He wrote back with advice that was equal parts tenderness and iron. Keep your speed. Do not chase what you cannot catch. Choose when to fight. The Zero is a miracle if you let it be, and a death sentence if you ask it to be something else. By October, the calendar itself had joined the cactus side. Rains came, revetments roofed themselves in scavenged tin, and the runway stayed a runway because Seabees forced it to. The American supply line shortened in every way that mattered. Fewer days at sea per crate, fewer hours per engine change, fewer minutes between scramble horn and formation. Japan's line lengthened in ways you could not draw on a map. Veteran pools shallowed, replacement training shrank, fuel quality wavered. Men arrived at Buin with 100 hours who would have been sent back to the classroom in 1941. They learned in the air, or they didn't. The Model 32's clipped wing showed its teeth when a fight stayed vertical and close. In the long pull home it showed its invoice. More than one Zero flamed out within sight of Balail's strip and slid into the shallows, pilot stepping onto the wing as if exiting a streetcar, then stepping into water that erased the airplane in 10 minutes. The sea keeps secrets grudgingly in the tropics. Each wreck was a lesson in fluid dynamics and doctrine. American names acquired gravity. Foss became a warning, Smith a weather report, Marine Wildcats, a phrase that made briefers tap a spot on the board where the ambush would likely live. On nights when the Tokyo Express got through, the day still took its due. Henderson launched TBFs with flares and SBDs with bombs, and the slot turned into a chalkboard of arcs drawn in burning magnesium. The Japanese answer, send Zeros to ride herd over the return at dawn, only worked when the fuel sums allowed it. Increasingly, they didn't. On both sides, ground crews became the last quiet aces. At Buin, a team could change a Sakai cylinder bank in hours and cheat death for one more sortie. At Henderson, a crew could straighten a Wildcats bent spar with jacks and a prayer, fill the self-sealing cells with fresh fuel, and send the same bent brawler up again. Skill always mattered. What changed on Guadalcanal was the value of a second chance. Americans banked them. Japanese spent them the moment they strapped in. By November, P-38s prowled the slot with bellies full of fuel and wings full of habit. The long-legged twin, derided by some as too big for a knife fight, turned out to be a guillotine when flown with discipline. Boom once, zoom away, do not loiter. Zeros could still cut a lightning apart if the merge turned into a dance, but the dance happened less often. Range had finally met its better in range plus resilience. The campaign's end was not a trumpet, but a ledger going quiet. The last big Japanese push in October failed to shove Henderson into the sea. The last big daylight raids lost too many airplanes to justify the ink. The Tokyo Express kept feeding a fight that no longer paid dividends. In February 1943, Japan pulled its garrison off Guadalcanal under the cover of night and weather, a tactical success that conceded the strategic bill. The empty bunk at Buin stayed empty. Sakai would heal enough to fly again, to teach, to hunt in new skies under a different calendar where the arithmetic had grown crueler still. But the shape of the lesson he carried back into the war had been set over a coral strip called Henderson. An Air Force wins when it can afford mistakes and still show up tomorrow. On the slot, tomorrow belonged to those who could take a burst and keep flying, who could add a pilot's name to the roster instead of chiseling it into coral. Somewhere in a museum case, his torn helmet sits under glass, salt stiff in the leather, blood turned the colour of varnish. It is not a relic of victory or defeat so much as proof that a single man can measure a campaign with his body. A missing eye, an empty bunk, a chalkboard wiped clean and written again. These are the artifacts that tell why the Solomons bent history. Not because one side had better men, but because one side could bring good men back tomorrow with airplanes that forgave their first mistake. In that math, Guadalcanal chose its owner, and it wrote the rest of the Pacific War in the same hand. January 1943 wrote a new kind of problem on the slot: how to subtract. For 5 months, Guadalcanal had been arithmetic done with bayonets and propellers. Add ships, add sorties, add graves. Now the Imperial Navy brought a different equation to the board. Operation K, not a charge, but a withdrawal done at 30 knots in black water, an exercise in negative numbers. The order was simple and astonishing. Empty the island without letting the enemy notice until the ledger read 0. Sakai was thousands of miles away when the chalk line was drawn, still learning depth and distance with one eye in a hospital that smelled of carbolic and resignation. His letters from the south were concise and spare. We will reinforce as if to stay. We will leave as if we never came. He knew the grammar of such tricks. In China he had seen columns march in circles to inflate a head count. At Leh he had watched decoys pull enemy strikes off the real target. But this was larger, a fleet's sleight of hand performed under the eyes of radar and the teeth of Henderson. Buin's line of zeros, new men standing where old names had once been chalked, took the stage cues without being told the whole script. They flew at dawn and at noon, and in the last blue light, sometimes with bombs under the wings to hammer Henderson's revetments, sometimes clean to bait the cactus flights into burning fuel on fruitless chases. The Model 32's clipped wings still offered a vicious roll, but the pilots eyed their gauges more than their enemies. Every scrap of energy might be needed for the ride home. On good days, the long-winged Model 22 returned to the line, and the squadron breathed easier. On bad days, a mechanic would pull a cowl and find shrapnel glitter where the Sakai's breath should be. Across the water, Henderson's pattern pulsed like a generator. The Cactus Air Force had grown from a handful of Wildcats and SBDs into a layered organism. Marine squadrons that knew every wrinkle of the strip by the feel through the seat. Army P-38 Lightnings slanting down from Fighter II with bellies full of fuel and bellies full of patience. P-40 Lightnings and P-39s that fought low and mean. TBFs that went to sea at dusk with flares and come-home luck. The field had radars now, the sirens howl starting before eyes could find specks. Another minute bought for climb and rendezvous. In February, blue-nosed strangers with bent wings, F-4U Corsairs, taxied out with the casual menace of a new chapter. The Americans were not just holding, they were updating. K's deception demanded noise. While destroyers rehearsed the night lanes down the slot, daylight became theatre. Zeros slashed shipping lanes they had no intention of contesting after dark. Bettys, fragile as ever, pushed south to keep the habit of noon bombers alive even when the torpedo racks were more rumour than threat. On the nights chosen for extraction, the day raids thickened. More fighters, more high-cover sweeps, more decoys over Tulagi, so that the evening's hush would read as exhaustion, not intent. Doctrine became costume. The destroyers did their part with deadly elegance. They came through rain in line ahead, decks awash, smokestacks throttled to keep the wake low, searchlights hooded. At 30 knots, the math of interception collapses. A coastal gun crew calculates, then watches target and solution pass each other in the dark like strangers on a platform. On the first run, end of January, boats nosed into Tassafaronga and Coley Point and loaded men by the thousands. Hungry, malarial shadows who had held the jungle by habit after logistics had abandoned them. Rice balls wrapped in leaves moved down a human chain to mouths too tired to chew. On paper, the first night retrieved about 5,000. On the second and third nights, they took the rest. 10,000 plus ghosts leaving an island that had learned their steps. Henderson did not sleep. TBFs hunted wakes with parachute flares that turned the water to hammered silver. SBDs dived at shadows that might be barges or reef or wishful thinking. Wildcats orbited until the gauges scolded. The radars saw much and understood less. The Japanese rehearsals and feints had taught the operators humility. More than once, a path of phosphorescence looked like nothing at all until morning reports from the coast watchers, lean men with notebooks and nerves of wire, whispered the truth. They are taking them off. In the air, the calculus that had ruled since August didn't change. It accumulated. A zero that lingered to strafe a column of drums at Henderson might bag an honest victory by daylight, but the braver choice was often the quieter one. Deny Henderson's fighters an engagement late enough to spill into twilight, keep them circling over the strip while the night's real work, subtraction, took place beyond the reach of their tanks. Pilots are paid to fight, K paid them to manage. Some chafed, a few disobeyed, slashing at the field to scratch the itch. Most flew the plan because they could read the map of graves. Attrition spoke in other dialects. The veteran pool at Buin had thinned to clever scars, and the replacement's logbooks had fewer hours each month. Fuel quality wobbled. A Sakai that should have purred at cruise ran rough at mixture settings the manuals blessed. The gunnery range had given way to the front. Men learned deflection by burning it into muscle memory in the first week or not at all. Henderson's men learned too, but the difference was this. A Wildcat or Corsair that took a first-burst mistake could limp home, roll into a revetment, and be hammered straight by morning. Forgiveness multiplies experience. The Japanese system had asked genius to substitute for spares. It could not do so forever. Sakai followed it all through the thin mail. Blue paper from Buin, chemical pencil from Rabaul. occasional larger envelopes from staff officers who had the time to craft sentences. The Americans cover the transports like a sky laid shingle on shingle. The lightnings do not loiter, but they are always somewhere. The Bettys burn if you look at them hard. Still they go. He sent back the only advice that felt honest. Keep altitude as money. Spend it only once. Do not let the enemy decide when you fight. It was the same counsel he would give a student on a calm morning a decade later, but here the stakes were measured in regiments saved or abandoned. On 7th February 1943, Marines probed forward expecting another week of clawing. They found cooking fires cold and neat, personal things left behind like plantings for archaeologists, letters, a pair of getter, a photograph gone to pulp, crates turned to benches for a mess that would not form again. The jungle smelled of rain and old rice. The ledger on Guadalcanal closed not with the bang of a victory parade, but with the quiet of a well-run evacuation. The Americans had been deceived at the scale that matters, intent, long enough to let the last destroyers nose out, reverse, and draw a white line north through black water. The island changed owners the way a room changes owners, by someone carrying out the last box. The campaign's proofs lasted longer than the month. Henderson became a hub from which newer math radiated. New Georgia, Colombangara, Bougainville, each name a rung up the ladder toward Rabaul. The P-38's long legs, tested over cactus, would sketch a line up the slot in April to a dot over Bougainville, where a certain formation flew on a predictable schedule. An interception history would name Operation Vengeance. The same arithmetic that had made the lightning a fact of cactus life, range plus speed plus discipline, made that ambush possible. The Zero could still kill at the merge. The war was learning to fight where the merge never happened. For Japan, K's success hid a bill it could not pay twice. Saving 10,000 men from the island meant they would fight again in New Georgia, then die without logistics again. The air groups that covered the withdrawal expended their irreplaceable capital, aces, experience, engines that had one more month of hours left in them, so that the ledger could read clean on one page and bleed on the next. Withdrawal can be tactical genius and strategic confession in the same sentence. Sakai returned to the south later, hard-eyed and gentle with students, a hunter tempered into a teacher. Guadalcanal had already become a museum you could still fly over, coral runway patched and extended, wrecks whitening in jungle creeks, a line of revetments where boys with too much courage had learned the cost of their first mistake. The men who had fought there carried its arithmetic forward in the way their hands moved on throttles and in the questions they asked at briefings. What is our fuel at the merge? What is our plan if the plan does not survive? How many minutes can we buy with what we have? Operation K taught the last quiet lesson of the campaign. Sometimes the strongest proof of power is the ability to leave intact. It is a cold kind of victory, the kind measured by absence. On the slot it read like this: destroyers that did not stop, airplanes that did not linger, and an island that woke one morning to find the enemy had already become history. The artifact fits inside a manila folder, brittle as a wing spar left too long in salt air. One page from the Japanese 4th Air Group war diary, captured on Guadalcanal after a patrol stumbled onto a deserted bivouac and a cache of papers hidden in an ammunition crate. Fibres yellowed, grid lines ruled in purple pencil, columns titled with tidy kanji, date, unit, aircraft, pilots, takeoff, landing, fuel, ammunition, remarks. The handwriting is precise, junior officer careful. In a margin, a name appears and disappears with the day, Sakai Saburō. It is not a hero's signature, it is an entry on a balance sheet. August 1942 is compressed into 7 vertical inches. The first line for the 7th lists Rabaul to Lunga in neat characters, launch times that make no sense until you remember the distance, over 560 nautical miles north to south, a Zero's endurance drawn like a bowstring. Fuel, 330 litres internal, 330 external. Ammunition, 20 mm, 120 rounds per gun, 7.7 mm, full belt. Remarks: escort of G4M, heavy anti-aircraft, enemy pursuit intense. The last column has the word that keeps its own counsel: return. A small circle for yes, a slash for damaged, a dash for did not. What the page knows, the Sky already wrote across Tulagi that morning. Sakai's name receives a circle at takeoff, an arrow connecting to escort, Betty Group, then nothing in the landing box. Down the margin, a clerk squeezes a later note: hit by tail gunner, returned Rabaul with injury, aircraft severely damaged. There's nothing heroic in the way the characters crowd each other. The paper has no room for legend, only for logistics. But legend lives between the lines. The long crawl home, the gauze, the one good eye, the dried blood on a leather helmet that would someday sit under museum glass. Beneath Sakai's line, other names enter the ledger and fall out of it like stones off a cliff. Ota, Sasai, Nishizawa, each written with the same cool hand that writes fuel and ammo. Against them, numbers. 3G claimed here, 2G there, and the single character that always arrives to complicate claims, Bu Ming, unknown. When you lay an American operations summary next to this page, the Cactus Daily Sheet with its own columns for launch, CAP, scramble, kills claimed, damaged, downed, you see the mirror image hubris of air war. Both sides swear to more wreckage than the jungle will produce. The diary's math is tidier than the battlefield's. The artifact shows something the Sky does not reveal easily: fuel as fate. Next to each sortie is a figure for Ketsuin that reads like a prayer in litres. The Model 21 could carry roughly 520 litres in its wing and fuselage tanks, and hang another 300 plus under its belly. The clerk here writes 330, nay/330Y at dawn, and 240, nay/dash at dusk, as if to say, the drop tank's gone early, the fight must be short, the return austere. In the remarks, pencil lingers on the same arithmetic: low clouds, mixture leaned, enemy over Henderson, no pursuit beyond line. 2 aircraft found short of Kahili, ditched. Numbers in a margin record the losses that weren't from bullets at all. The diary's rightmost column carries the running tally commander's crave, claims this date, the boast that oils morale. But even here, the clerk betrays a cautious mind. On the 12th he writes Jijui Wu, 5 downed, then adds Yao Jiao He to be verified. On the 18th, claims drop to 1 with a crisp confirmed, and in the remarks he allows himself an extra brushstroke. Enemy pilots skilled, aircraft sturdy, long combat, fuel tight. A paper admission that Henderson's calculus, armour, self-sealing, second chances, has moved from rumour to doctrine. Mid-page, a small rectangle boxed off with ruler straight care. Zhengbei, maintenance. Under it, Sakai 12 engine. Compression uneven on cylinders 3 and 8. Fuel pump replaced. Oil dilution system unreliable after long cruise. Dan Yao Dai Kie. Ammunition belt tear on the port 7.7. The words are dry. But they imply a day spent with cowls off, hands dirty, mechanics speaking softly to a machine as if to a skittish animal. The diary knows what the pilots feel. Long-range war eats engines and men from the inside outward. There's a line item that doesn't fit cleanly with battles. Shu Lei Ti Chu, documents submitted. The remark cites a code, the naval equivalent of see also. Interrogation of captured reports indicates enemy field is operational. Coastal watchposts active. The paper that records Japanese launches also records Japanese awareness that the island itself has eyes and ears that recite new math, time from sighting to siren to scramble. This is where the artifact's edges touch other artifacts. The Coast Watcher notebook that lists 102080 in spidery ink, a field telephone that hums like a hive, a Marine's log that notes bogies, north by northwest, Angels 20. Lower on the page, a change in unit designation creeps in with bureaucratic indifference. Tainan Kong becomes Di Wu Yi Kong. Tainan gives the ledger over to 251 Air Group as the war shuffles squadrons like a shell game. The handwriting stays the same, but the names begin to change. There is a gravity in the swap that the pencil does not note. Many of the original hands are gone. Their replacements will learn or die a week later. In the far margin, someone records a quartermaster's trivia that is anything but Wu Xian Shou Xin Zhuang Tai Liang, radio reception good, for 2 days running, then E, poor, the next. A man bent over a set will decide whether a pilot hears turn back before hunger does it for him. Strip the page of myth and it remains a map drawn in ink and exhaustion. On the 21st, a sortie to Lunga convoy cover lists takeoff 0520, landing 11:35, 6 hours and 15 minutes if you believe the pencil. The officer probably miscopied one digit, or perhaps a zero really did loiter between squalls, buying minutes with mixture, hunting a shadow and finding rain instead. In the remarks, a weary confession. No visual. Returned with ammunition. One aircraft failed to report. Presumed lost at sea. The line is more haunting than any kill claim. Artifacts tell truths that speeches don't. This page says the Tainan/251 fight over Guadalcanal was not a string of duels, but a long failing negotiation with distance. It says the Japanese pilots flew near the limits of an airplane designed to be a rapier and used like a spear. It says fuel made liars of courage, and the sea made orphans of statistics. It says that a clerk who never strapped on a parachute could still write a better epitaph than most historians by marking a dash where a circle should have been. We think of courage as a vertical thing, dives and climbs and last bursts, but the diary insists it is horizontal, holding headings across an ocean, leaning mixture until the engine talks back, refusing an extra turn over Henderson because the gauge frowns. It also insists on the democracy of chance. On the 24th, a pilot with 10 claims lands short of Kahili because the wind shifts. On the 25th, a pilot with no claims fights his airplane through a squall and arrives with 4 litres and a story. The pencil honours both with the same tiny circle. At the bottom, a final annotation appears, squeezed into the gutter between entries like a throat clearing after the song. Ban Jing Hai Jun Xiao Wei, Fu Shang Gui Huan, Naval Ensign Sakai, wounded, returned. The clerk, decorous to the end, does not add the rest. The blood, the blind eye, the navigation done through pain and will. The paper does not know it will outlive many of the men it lists. It does what paper does, proves that for a while order argued with chaos and sometimes won. If you hold the diary page up to light, you can see the impressions of the pencil on the sheet beneath. Ghosts of sorties, not yet written on the day this one was filled out. That is Guadalcanal in miniature. Tomorrow presses upward into today, a reverse relief. Henderson's chalkboard will record its own sums at dusk. Cap 12, SBD 8, TBF 4, claims 3, losses 1, and the jungle will shrug at both ledgers. But this single page, rescued from an ammunition crate and saved by somebody who understood paper could be a witness, shows how the Tainan pilots measured their lives. Not in aces tallies, not in memoir paragraphs, but in litres, rounds, minutes, headings, and small circles that meant you came back. Artifact: a single V-mail sheet, creased where a thumb always found the same corner, addressed to Mrs. E. Peoria, Illinois, stamped passed by naval censor. The National World War II Museum keeps the original. The copy here shows the faint half-tone grain of microfilm. Date: 7th of August 1942. Time inked in later by a careful archivist, 1615. In a blocky hand that looks like a machinist's notes more than a letter, a radioman gunner writes home about a noon sky that turned arithmetic into blood. Ma, you asked what the back seat is like. Think of sitting in a washtub with 2 lawnmower engines and a sewing machine between them. The sewing machine is mine. He means the twin AN/M 2.30S on their scarf-style mount, each drum already checked twice, feed chutes polished with graphite so a jam won't arrive when geometry does. The Dauntlesses that day held a box 4x4, distances drilled into muscle. Keep your intervals, keep your cones overlapping. Doctrine fits on a postcard. Turn the formation into an inversion of a porcupine. The pilot calls, "Keep your head on a swivel," and I tell him I got 2. The 0 comes down like a handsaw through pine, and he looks so sure of the cut you would almost let him have it. I don't. He describes the moment Sakai always said he misjudged, the apparent easy pass on slow movers, though the gunner doesn't know names, only angles. He writes how the first tracers went wide, then walked forward into a precise mean lattice where a cockpit would be. He notes, as if filing a maintenance chit, that the ring sight bead sat a finger's width left because of slipstream, that he compensated without thinking, that he had rehearsed this with a broomstick in a stateside hangar until wrists learned what math meant. We are told not to get excited about hits, get excited about stopping him. I saw glass. Then I saw his nose wag like a drunk, and I let off because he fell away under us. I didn't cheer. I checked the chutes. The line says everything about Henderson's calculus before Henderson had a name. Persistence over flourish. In a margin, a grease-penciled figure circles 450 rounds left, either his after-action note or a later docent's annotation. The number is less important than what it implies. The Navy's insistence on ammunition and training enough that a rear gunner could afford to hold fire until the sight was honest, then spend in a single coherent stream. The V-mail's middle paragraph is all logistics. He praises the Ordnance Gang's habit of baking belts in the sun to keep the links dry. He mentions a petty officer who makes every gun crew recite stoppage drills before chow. He thanks a boy from Biloxi who tunes mounts by feel. This is Guadalcanal before the name stuck. Work as armour. Then the letter turns human in a way no debrief ever can. It wasn't like the pictures. He came close. His face was a quick thing and then gone. I don't hate him, Ma. I was busy. Later I thought about him the way a man thinks about a bolt you torqued and hope you didn't strip. You do the job and then you sit on your bunk and your hands won't learn how to stop. No names, no boasts, just a mechanic's conscience in a gunner's seat. Post-war, historians would bend back to this noon and line it up with a Japanese ace's wound and impossible return. The letter doesn't claim that. It claims only duty done correctly once. In the last inches of paper, the voice returns to measurements. We took 2 holes and one in the tail that looks like a mouse chewed it. The pilot says nice shooting, and I say thank the boys who load the belts. I still got my lucky penny taped inside the turret. If you send cookies, send the kind that don't mind heat. It ends with the small economy of V-mail. No room for flourish, only for things that matter in a war built from parts. A thanks to the ARM/AMM rates who feed the guns. Love to a mother who understands that cookies behave like components in heat. Reassurance that the machine and the men will report again tomorrow. The artifact belongs here, because it does what our ledgers and claims and after-action reports rarely manage. It shows the bridge between design and outcome. 2.30 caliber guns, despised on paper by men who worshipped 20mm, became decisive because they were where they needed to be, fed by belts that did not jam, fired by hands drilled past fear. The V-mail page smells, even now, faintly of damp cardboard and the sweet machine oil of a museum drawer. Read in the context of Sakai's story, it is not triumphalist. It is proof that a formation's geometry, a supply line's steadiness, and a rear gunner's wrists can change the sentence of a war, one measured burst at a time.